What if I told you there's a wedding tradition so shocking that guests literally watch the couple? Well, let's just say, seal the deal 3 times in one night. And I'm not talking about some obscure ancient ritual. 23. This happened to Marie Antoinette, countless European royals, and millions of people for over 1,000 years. Before you click away thinking this is clickbait, stick around because the psychological reasons behind this will absolutely blow your mind. And by the end of this video, you'll never look at modern weddings the same way again. Welcome back to the channel. I'm your host, and today we're diving into one of the most bizarre and uncomfortable wedding traditions that ever existed. This isn't your typical something old, something new tradition. This is something that would make even the most open-minded person today absolutely cringe. Now, I know what you're thinking. This sounds absolutely insane, right? But this tradition reveals some truly dark insights about power, control, and human psychology that will change how you see history forever. So what exactly am I talking about? Picture this. You've just had your wedding ceremony. You're exhausted, maybe a little tipsy, and you're looking forward to finally having some private time with your new spouse. But instead of being left alone, your wedding guests, your parents, siblings, friends, and complete strangers literally escort you to your bedroom. But here's where it gets absolutely twisted. These witnesses wouldn't just drop you off and wish you luck. Oh no, that would be too merciful. They would actually stay in the room to watch you, to consummate your marriage, with their own eyes, taking notes. And in the most extreme cases, the ones that inspire today's shocking title, THA, couples were required to perform this intimate act not just once, but 3 times throughout the night, with witnesses staying for each and every occurrence. Let me paint you the most shocking picture. When Marie Antoinette married the future King Louis XVI in 1770, she was just 14 years old. Her bedding ceremony was attended by dozens of witnesses, high-ranking officials, clergy members, and foreign dignitaries, all crowding around her bedroom. But here's the part that will absolutely horrify you. Marie Antoinette and Louis couldn't actually complete the act for 7 years. 7 years. The trauma from having all these people watching, judging, taking notes was so intense that they literally couldn't perform despite multiple witnessed attempts. If you're as disturbed by this as I am, smash that subscribe button because we're about to go even deeper into this psychological nightmare. The French court was so panicked about this that they brought in doctors to examine the couple. They had medical professionals inspect their bodies. They documented everything. Can you imagine being a teenage girl, already terrified about your wedding night, and then having doctors, priests, and politicians all discussing your most private moments? Now let's talk about that shocking requirement, 3 times in one night. This wasn't just some random number. In medieval law, 3 successful acts were considered absolute proof that couldn't be contested in court. Imagine the psychological torture. You're already nervous. You have an audience of strangers staring at you, and you know that if you can't perform 3 times, your marriage could be annulled, wars could start, and kingdoms could fall. Some couples would literally collapse from exhaustion and stress. Historical records describe newlyweds fainting, having panic attacks, and some even trying to flee the country rather than face these ceremonies. Want to know exactly who was watching these poor couples? At the front row were bishops and cardinals, holy men of God, standing there with notebooks. Behind them, political ambassadors representing different countries, all making sure their investments were protected. Then came the family members, your own parents and siblings watching you in your most vulnerable moment. And finally, court scribes literally writing down every detail for legal documentation. One account from the Holy Roman Empire describes over 40 witnesses forming a semicircle around the bed, with specific positions assigned based on rank. The couple later described it as performing for a theater audience, but naked and terrified. If you thought having people watch was the worst part, you're wrong. After the act, witnesses would examine the bed sheets for evidence, Blood-stained sheets would be displayed publicly the next morning like trophies. But it gets worse. Court physicians would sometimes conduct medical examinations of both partners before and after to provide official documentation. These examinations were so invasive and humiliating that some noble families hired professional witnesses who would lie about what they observed just to spare the couple's additional trauma. The psychological damage from these ceremonies was catastrophic. Historical records show that many noble marriages never recovered from this trauma. Couples who were forced through bedding ceremonies had significantly higher rates of what we now recognize as PTSD, anxiety disorders, and sexual dysfunction. Some developed such severe performance anxiety that they couldn't be intimate, even in private, for years afterward. Others became obsessed with privacy and would have guards posted outside their bedrooms for the rest of their lives, terrified that someone might be watching. There are documented cases of nobles who chose exile, gave up their titles, or even committed suicide rather than face these ceremonies. The psychological torture was so intense that it literally drove people insane. Let me give you 3 examples that will absolutely blow your mind. In 1469, Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, Miraces, the couple who sponsored Columbus, 19, had over 30 political representatives watching the consummation. The pressure was so intense that Ferdinand reportedly vomited from anxiety before the ceremony. When England's Prince Arthur married Catherine of Aragon in 1501, the ceremony was so elaborate they needed a 10-page protocol document. Arthur was so traumatized by the experience that courtiers reported he never spoke to his wife again, except in public ceremonies. But perhaps the most horrific example comes from a German principality where the local lord was so obsessed with ensuring legitimacy that he required couples to consummate their marriages on a stage in the Great Hall in front of the entire court. This practice continued for over 200 years until the family line literally died out because potential brides refused to marry into it. Here's something that rarely gets talked about. People fought back. By the Renaissance, some couples were finding creative ways to resist these horrific traditions. Some hired actors to stand in for them during ceremonies. Others bribed witnesses to provide false testimony. There are records of couples who eloped to avoid bedding ceremonies, sparking international incidents and sometimes wars. One French duchess became legendary for refusing her bedding ceremony and barricading herself in her room with armed guards. The political crisis lasted for months, but she eventually won and started a trend among French nobility to reject the practice. So what finally killed these nightmarish traditions? It wasn't just changing attitudes about privacy, it was the sheer psychological carnage they were causing. By the 1,600 seconds, royal families were realizing that traumatized, sexually dysfunctional couples weren't producing heirs. The very purpose of political marriages, rejecting, creating dynasties, was being destroyed by the ceremonies meant to legitimize them. The final nail in the coffin came during the French Revolution, when the common people, who had been forced to endure these ceremonies for centuries, literally executed the nobles who had imposed them. The trauma and rage built up over generations finally exploded. Here's something that will disturb you. Elements of these practices survived much longer than you'd expect. Some rural European communities continued modified versions into the 1,900 seconds. Even today, certain wedding traditions like guests throwing rice or the bride being given away contain echoes of community ownership over intimate relationships. But perhaps most shocking of all, modern research has shown that cultures with historical bedding ceremony traditions have significantly higher rates of sexual dysfunction and relationship anxiety, even today, suggesting generational trauma that lasted for centuries. The most disturbing part of researching this topic has been reading the actual documents that survived. The Vatican's secret archives contain thousands of detailed reports from bedding ceremonies, some so explicit they read like medical experiments rather than wedding records. One document from 1547 describes a ceremony where the couple was so traumatized they couldn't complete the act despite 6 hours of attempts while witnesses waited. The bride reportedly screamed so loudly that servants thought she was being murdered. These aren't just historical curiosities. They're evidence of systematic psychological torture that was considered normal and necessary for over 1,000 years. Think about this the next time you complain about your relatives being annoying at weddings. These people had to perform the most intimate act of their lives in front of crowds multiple times while being judged, documented, and inspected. The fact that humans survived this level of systematic trauma and still managed to build loving relationships shows incredible resilience. It also reminds us how precious our privacy and personal autonomy really are, things that millions of people throughout history never got to experience. What's the most shocking historical fact you've learned today? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one and often get ideas for future videos from your suggestions. If this video made you grateful for modern relationships and privacy, smash that like button. Your engagement helps this content reach people who are fascinated by the dark and shocking truths of human history. Subscribe and hit the notification bell if you want more mind-bending historical content that schools never taught you. Next week, we're covering medieval torture devices that were specifically designed for wedding punishments, and trust me, it makes today's topic look mild. Thanks for watching this deep dive into one of humanity's most disturbing traditions. I'll see you next week where we continue exploring the shocking truths that shaped our world.